The wagon hit a rut, and Clara Bellamy grabbed the side rail hard enough to splinter a nail. She didn't make a sound. She had learned over 19 years of being shuffled between other people's houses that making sounds when you were hurting only made things worse. People either ignored you or used it against you. Neither outcome was worth the effort. The driver, a stocky man named Denton who smelled of tobacco and wet wool, hadn't spoken to her in 3 hours. He'd set his piece back in Billings when he'd loaded her trunk onto the wagon bed with the kind of rough indifference you'd give a sack of feed corn. Silas Mercer's place is a day's ride north. You'll work for him till next November. He'll send word when your time's done. That was it. No further explanation. No reassurance that the man she was being sent to wasn't the sort who drank too much or had a short temper. No mention of what the work actually entailed beyond household management, which Clara had learned was a polite way of saying everything nobody else wants to do. She watched Montana roll past her in long, colorless waves. It was early March, and the land up here hadn't decided if it was done with winter yet. Gray sky pressed down on gray hills. Patches of snow sat in the hollows like something the earth had forgotten to swallow. The wind came in sideways, sharp enough to water the eyes. Clara did not find it beautiful. She found it honest. It looked exactly like what it was. Hard country that didn't particularly care if you made it or not. She was used to that. Her guardian, Edmund Hale, had made the arrangement 3 weeks ago. He'd called her into his study in his careful, measured way, the way he did everything, and told her he'd found a situation for her. A rancher up north. Widower, 5 children. Needed someone capable and steady. The contract was for 1 year, and at the end of it, she'd receive a modest sum. Enough to get herself established somewhere, he said, as if that phrase had any concrete meaning for a girl with no family, no connections, and no particular place in the world. He'd called it an opportunity. Claire had sat across the desk from him and nodded and said, "Yes, sir," at the appropriate moments, and she had not asked the question that was burning a hole through the back of her throat. Why? Not why was he sending her. She knew why. Edmund Hale was 52 years old and recently remarried to a woman named Patricia, who found Clara's presence in the house uncomfortable. Patricia hadn't said so directly. She communicated through pointed silences and small rearrangements, moving Clara's things from the front bedroom to the back one, stopping, including her in dinner conversation, eventually just looking through her like she was a window rather than a person. Edmund Hale, who had taken Clara in 7 years ago when her mother died and left her genuinely to no one, was a man who avoided confrontation above all other things. His solution to the tension between his new wife and his ward was to remove the source of the tension, which was Clara. So she didn't ask why. She already knew. The question she'd swallowed was the other one, the one she'd been swallowing since she was 12 years old and first understood her situation. Is there anywhere I actually belong? The wagon lurched again. Clara braced. Almost there, Denton said without looking at her. She saw the ranch before she saw the house. A cluster of outbuildings first. A large barn, 2 smaller structures, a fenced corral where 3 horses stood in the cold with their backs to the wind. Then the house came into view. 2 stories, wood-framed, with a covered porch running the full width of the front. It had been a solid house once. You could still see the bones of it, but the paint had faded to something between gray and nothing, and one of the porch railings had come loose and hadn't been fixed. A window on the second floor had a crack in it patched with what looked like oilcloth. People live here, Clara thought, but they haven't been tending to things. Denton pulled the horses to a stop in the yard and climbed down without helping her. She climbed down herself, her boots landing in mud that sucked at her heels, and stood looking at the house. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the front door opened and a man stepped onto the porch. Silas Mercer was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of lean, worn-down build that came from years of physical work and not enough rest. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least 4 days. His eyes were a pale, flat gray, like the sky over the hills, and they moved over Clara with the same brief, assessing look you'd give a fence post you were thinking of replacing. He was not unkind looking. He was also not particularly welcoming looking. He looked like a man who had made peace with being very tired for a very long time. "You're the girl Hale sent," he said. It was not a question. "Clara Bellamy," she said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her trunk in the wagon bed, then back at her. "You eat much?" She blinked. I... Pardon? It's a practical question, he said without any humor. Winter stores are lower than I'd like. I need to know what I'm feeding. Clara stared at him for exactly 2 seconds. I eat to keep working, she said. Not beyond that. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, just acknowledgement, maybe, that she'd answered without flinching. Good, he said. He turned to Denton. You can leave the trunk. I'll send payment to Hale through the usual channels. And just like that, Denton climbed back onto the wagon, turned the horses, and drove away. Clara watched him go. Then she picked up her bag, left her trunk in the mud, and walked toward the porch steps. Leave your boots at the door, Silas said, already turning back inside. And don't touch anything in the study. That's mine. The inside of the house was warmer than outside, which was the best thing Clara could say for it in those first minutes. She stood in the entry hall and took stock while Silas disappeared somewhere deeper into the house without further instruction. The floors were wood, decently solid underfoot, but the rug in the hallway was worn through in 2 places. The coat hooks by the door held a collection of children's jackets in various states of disrepair. A missing button here, a torn elbow there. Someone had attempted to patch one of them and done a creditable but not expert job. A staircase rose to her right, dark wood, solid banister. Through the doorway ahead, she could see a kitchen with a large iron stove. To her left, what she guessed was the sitting room. She could hear children. Not loud. No running, no shouting. Just the small sounds of presence. A creak of floorboard. The faint murmur of a voice, then silence. Clara hung her coat and her hat on the one available hook and walked toward the kitchen. It was a large room built for function. A long table dominated the center, with 8 chairs around it, though one had a broken leg propped up on a piece of wood to compensate. The stove was good quality, older but well built. The wood box beside it was less than half full. The counter held the evidence of recent meal preparation. A pot that had been used for porridge, she guessed. A board with breadcrumbs. A knife someone had left out rather than put away. Not chaos. But not a household running smoothly either. It was a household running on momentum and diminishing energy, the way a wagon rolls after the horse has stopped pulling. You're not what I pictured. Clara turned. A girl stood in the doorway. 14, maybe 15, with dark hair pulled back severely, and Silas Mercer's same flat, assessing gray eyes. She was wearing an apron that was too large for her, and her expression managed to combine curiosity, suspicion, and preemptive dismissal into one remarkably efficient look. What did you picture? Clara asked. Older? Heavier? More the mothering type? The girl crossed her arms. I'm Nora. I'm the one who's actually been running this house for the past 8 months, so before you start rearranging things, I'd appreciate knowing what you think you're here to do. Clara considered her. She recognized the posture, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, voice carrying more confidence than the eyes actually held. She'd used that posture herself, many times. It was the posture of a person who had taken on too much and was terrified of someone noticing how close they were to dropping it. I'm not here to rearrange anything, Clara said. I'm here to help. We don't need help. All right. Nora blinked. She'd been braced for an argument. All right? If you don't need help, tell me what you need, and I'll do that instead. Clara gestured at the stove. Do you need someone to see to the fire? The wood box is getting low. A pause. Then, with the reluctant air of someone conceding a minor point, Nora said, The wood pile is around the east side of the house. Thomas is supposed to fill the box every morning, but he's been forgetting. I'll take care of it. Nora watched her for a moment longer, like she was waiting for some catch to reveal itself. When it didn't, she turned and went back through the doorway without another word. Clara found her way to the back door, out into the cold, and around the side of the house to the woodpile. It was adequately stocked. Someone had at least kept up with the chopping, and she began loading her arms. It was on her third trip back through the kitchen that she saw the second child. He was sitting at the far end of the table, very still, with a McGuffey reader open in front of him. He appeared to be about 10 years old with the same dark Mercer coloring, thick hair, serious expression, but something around his eyes was different from Nora's watchful sharpness. He looked like someone who was working very hard and quietly ashamed of the effort. He didn't look up when she came in. She put the wood in the box, brushed the bark dust off her sleeves, and said, without making a particular event of it, "That's a hard book." The boy looked up then, immediately suspicious. I can read it fine. I didn't say you couldn't. He looked back down. His finger was moving along a line of text, slowly, lips barely moving. Clara recognized the movement. She'd done the same thing at his age, when the letters kept sliding around on the page and refusing to stay in the order she needed them to be in. She didn't say anything else about it. She just built up the fire and started the process of figuring out what was in the pantry that could be turned into supper. I'm Thomas, the boy said eventually, without looking up. Clara, she said. Nice to meet you, Thomas. He grunted, which she suspected was his version of welcome. She met the rest of the children over the course of that first afternoon. The twins, Eli and May, were 7 years old, and they found her the way young children find anything new in a small environment, by appearing suddenly and without announcement, staring at her with round, unabashed eyes, and then retreating when she acknowledged them. They repeated this cycle approximately 4 times before May worked up the courage to ask, very seriously, whether Clara knew how to make butter cookies. I do, Clara said. Our mother made them, May said. Nora tries, but she burns the bottoms. I don't burn bottoms, Clara said, which earned a small, unconvinced look from May and a sideways glance from Eli that suggested he'd reserve judgment. The 5th child, and this one she didn't meet so much as observe, was a boy of about 5 named Sam. She saw him first through the sitting room doorway, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a collection of carved wooden animals arranged in some pattern only he understood. He was completely absorbed. He didn't respond when Eli said his name loudly from the doorway. He didn't look up when the floorboard creaked under Clara's weight. Later, Nora found her watching him and said quietly, Sam doesn't talk. He never has, really. He said a handful of words before Mama died, and since then, nothing. The doctor says there's nothing wrong with him physically. He just... She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. He just doesn't. How does he communicate? Clara asked. He has ways, Nora said. You'll learn them. It was the first thing Nora said that contained even a fragment of trust. The assumption that Clara would be around long enough to learn. Silas appeared at supper. He sat at the head of the table and ate with efficiency and very little conversation. Clara served the stew she'd made from what she'd found in the pantry. A serviceable meal, not remarkable, but warm and filling. The children ate. Silas ate. No one asked where the food had come from or whether it was good. At the end of the meal, Silas stood, looked at Clara, and said, Breakfast is at 5:30. The morning chores list is on the board in the kitchen. Don't wake Sam before 7. He doesn't sleep well, and once he's up, he's up. He paused. Your room is the one at the end of the upstairs hall. The latch on the door sticks. You have to lift the handle as you turn it. He said all of this in the tone of someone reading from a practical manual, and then he left the dining room. That night, in the narrow room at the end of the upstairs hall, the latch did stick, exactly as promised. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the single window that faced north. The glass was cold. The wind was picking up outside. She was not happy. She didn't particularly expect to be happy, but she was, in some way she hadn't anticipated, interested. These people were not cruel. They were broken in the specific quiet way that grief broke people. They'd pulled so far into their own wounds that they'd stopped seeing each other clearly. The house was functioning but not living. She thought about Edmund Hale's study. The careful, measured voice. An opportunity. For once, she thought he might have accidentally been right. The first week was about learning the geography of the place. Not just the physical layout, but the emotional one. She mapped it the way you'd map any unfamiliar territory, carefully, paying attention to what was fixed and what shifted. The kitchen was Nora's territory, and Nora guarded it with the particular ferocity of someone who had claimed it out of necessity rather than desire. She'd been cooking and managing the household since her mother died. Clara gathered this from context rather than anyone saying it directly, and she did it competently, if joylessly. She was 15 years old and carrying the weight of a grown woman's responsibilities, and the only way she'd survived it was by becoming very efficient and very rigid about how things were done. Clara's approach was not to challenge any of this. She moved into the kitchen's margins, the tasks Nora hadn't gotten to, the things that had fallen through the cracks. She noticed that no one had cleaned the stovepipe properly in months, that the root cellar door seal was letting in cold air that was affecting the stored vegetables, that the mending pile in the laundry room had reached a size that suggested it had been growing untouched since autumn. She worked through these things without announcement, not quietly in a self-effacing way. She wasn't performing humility. She was genuinely trying to understand what was needed before she tried to provide it. Thomas was in the house most mornings, supposedly working on his lessons, which he taught himself from a combination of the McGuffey readers and a dog-eared arithmetic primer. There was no school within reasonable distance, and Silas didn't seem to have made arrangements for a tutor. Clara pieced together, from watching Thomas's jaw tighten every time he sat down with the reader, that the reading was a genuine struggle, not from lack of intelligence, but from something in the way his mind processed the letters. She'd seen it before. She'd lived it before. On the fourth day, she sat down across from him at the table with her own work. She'd found a piece of mending that needed doing, and without looking up from the torn shirt collar, said, "If you read it out loud quietly, it sometimes helps. The words stay in place better when you hear them." A silence. "That's not how you're supposed to read," Thomas said. "Who told you there's a supposed to?" Another silence. Then, barely above a whisper, she heard him begin reading aloud, low enough that it didn't feel like a performance, just sound to anchor the letters. She didn't look up. She kept mending. After a while, he said, "I got through a whole page." "I know," she said. "I heard you." He didn't say thank you, but his shoulders dropped about 2 inches from where they'd been, and that was better than thank you. On the 8th day, she found the box. It was on the top shelf of the pantry, behind 2 tins of cornmeal, and she'd only reached for it because she was checking inventory and needed to know what they actually had. It was a plain wooden box, not locked, with a small brass hinge. She opened it, expecting seeds or some kind of dry goods. Inside was a collection of folded papers. Letters. No, not letters exactly. Notes. Written in a woman's hand, small and clear and practical, on pieces of whatever paper had been available. Some were on good stationery, some were on the back of receipts. One was on the inside of a flour bag, flattened out and written on with a careful economy that suggested the writer hadn't had better paper and hadn't wanted to wait. Clara almost closed the box immediately. These were clearly private, and private things that weren't hers were not hers. But the top note was unfolded, as if someone had read it recently and not replaced it properly, and her eyes caught 3 words before she could stop them. "When I'm gone." She stood there for a moment. Then she carefully closed the box and put it back exactly where it had been. That evening, when she brought the inventory list to Silas in the kitchen, he was at the table with the ranch accounts, a cup of coffee going cold beside him. She mentioned the pantry organization. "There's a box on the top shelf," she said, keeping her tone completely neutral. "Behind the cornmeal. I moved it to check the shelf behind it and then put it back. I didn't read what was inside." She had read 3 words, which she didn't mention. Silas looked at her. His expression didn't change much, but something moved behind his eyes. "That was my wife's," he said. "I thought it might be something like that. I wanted you to know I left it undisturbed." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, then back at his accounts. "Noted," he said. She took that as dismissal and went to bank the kitchen fire for the night. She was on her way to the stairs when his voice came from behind her, quieter than his usual register. "Her name was Ruth." Clara stopped, didn't turn around. "She was thorough," Silas said, "wrote things down. She liked to make sure people had what they needed, even when she wasn't there to give it." A pause. "Anyway," he said, and the word came out like a door closing. "Good night." "Good night," Clara said, and went up the stairs. She lay awake for a long time after, thinking about a woman who had known she was dying and had spent her remaining energy writing practical notes so that whoever came after her would know how to take care of her children. She thought that was one of the bravest things she'd ever heard of. The second week brought snow, which changed the character of the ranch entirely. The morning routine became harder, breaking ice in the water troughs, keeping pathways cleared between the house and the outbuildings, managing the animals' additional needs in the cold. Silas was out before dawn and often not back until after dark. He had a ranch hand, a quiet, weathered man named Cobb, who'd worked the place for 11 years. But the 2 of them were stretched thin. Clara absorbed what tasks she could from the house side. She took over the wood box filling entirely, which removed that source of friction with Thomas, and also gave her a legitimate reason to spend time in the barn, which she'd started to realize was where Sam sometimes went. She'd followed him once, carefully. He'd slipped out the back door after breakfast on a day when Nora was occupied with laundry and Thomas was at his lessons, and Clara had given him a head start and then gone after him, not to bring him back, but because a 5-year-old alone in a snowed-in barn in Montana seemed like a situation worth monitoring. He'd gone straight to a corner stall where a bay mare stood patiently. He'd pulled himself up onto the lowest railing and pressed his face against the horse's neck. The mare stood completely still. Sam made no sound, but his whole body loosened in a way Clara had not seen it do anywhere in the house. She stayed in the barn doorway and didn't approach him. After maybe 20 minutes, he came back past her to go inside. He didn't look at her, but at the door he stopped and very deliberately reached back and touched her sleeve. Just one brief contact, the back of his hand against her wrist, before he went in. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment after that and breathed carefully. Okay, she thought, okay. That evening, she told Nora casually that Sam had spent some time with the bay mare that morning. Nora's face did something complicated. He does that, she said. That horse was our mother's. She used to take Sam out to see her. He still goes. She's good with him, Claire said. The horse. Her name is Juniper, Nora said, and then abruptly, there's a loose thread on your collar. If you leave it, it'll unravel the whole seam. Clara put her hand to her collar. There was indeed a loose thread. She looked at Nora, who was already turning away, busy with something else. Thank you, Clara said. Nora made a small, dismissive sound, but her shoulders weren't quite as rigid as usual. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when she had her first real conversation with Silas Mercer. Not the practical exchanges. Those happened daily, efficiently, covering supply needs and work schedules and the children's various concerns. Silas was not a man who avoided necessary communication, but he kept all of it clipped and functional, the conversational equivalent of a fence line, marking boundary without making a point of it. The real conversation happened because of a broken harness buckle. Clara had been coming back from the barn with an empty water bucket when she saw Silas crouched in the yard, trying to fix a harness buckle with cold hands and fading light, and the expression of a man who was one more setback from losing his temper. She set the bucket down and crouched beside him. Let me, she said. He looked at her. My hands are warmer, she said, which was true, and I can see better from this angle. He sat back, not graciously, but he moved aside. She got the buckle fixed in about 4 minutes. The mechanism was seized, ice and wear, and needed to be worked loose before the pin would slide. She'd fixed enough harness buckles in her time at various households to know the method. When she handed it back to him, he looked at it, then at her. Where'd you learn that? Various places, she said. I've been in a lot of households. How many? She thought about it. 7, since I was 12. He digested this. 7 in 7 years, give or take. Why so many? She considered how to answer that, not because she was hiding anything, she'd made a kind of peace with her history, but because there was a version of the answer that was honest and a version that was simply discouraging, and they were nearly the same version. I was useful, she said, until I wasn't needed anymore, or until something changed in the household that made my presence inconvenient. I was never unkindly treated, she added, because that was true, and she thought he'd want to know it. I was just, she paused, temporary. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard. This is a 1-year contract, he said. His voice was steady and deliberate. I want you to be clear on that. I'm not in a position to offer more than that, and I won't mislead you. I'm clear on it, she said. Good. He stood, harness in hand. I appreciate the work you've been doing. The house is running better. The house was running before I got here. Nora was running it, he said. 15 years old running it. That's not the same thing. He looked at the house, the lighted windows against the early dark. She shouldn't have had to do that. It was, Clara realized, the most personal thing he'd said to her. Not about Ruth, not about himself, about his daughter, about something he felt he'd failed. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. She just picked up the bucket and went back toward the house. And he went toward the barn, and the wind picked up behind them both. She found the first note from Ruth on a Tuesday, entirely by accident. She'd been reorganizing the linen shelves They'd become a chaotic layering of mismatched sizes that took 3 minutes to sort through every time you needed anything. And behind a stack of wool blankets, she found a folded piece of paper with her name on it. Not her name. It said, "Whoever is keeping this house across the front." Clara stood with it in her hands for a long moment. She unfolded it. The third shelf from the bottom in the linen closet is where the good towels go. The ones with the blue hem. Those are for fevers and for births and for the worst nights. Keep them there and don't let them migrate. You'll want to know where they are when you need them in a hurry, and you won't want to be hunting. The twins share a blanket in winter. If they have separate ones, May steals Eli's and then they fight. One big blanket, problem solved. Thomas will not tell you when he's struggling. He'll just get quieter. Watch for the quiet. Sam goes to Juniper when the world is too loud for him. Don't try to talk him out of it. Just let him go and be there when he comes back. Clara sat down on the floor of the linen closet, folded paper in her hands, and read it 3 more times. Then she sat there in the half-dark, surrounded by the smell of cedar and old wool, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time and wasn't sure she had the right to feel. Like she was welcome. Not wanted, necessarily. Not loved, but welcome. The way a person is welcome when someone has prepared for them, left a door open, put a light on. Ruth Mercer had written these notes knowing she wouldn't be there, knowing someone else would have to come after her. And she had thought to make that easier. "When I'm gone," the note had started. Those were the 3 words Clara had seen through the box lid. She folded the paper back carefully and put it in her apron pocket. That night she made the butter cookies May had mentioned, from a recipe she knew from memory. She didn't announce them, she just put them on the table after supper, and May's face did something sudden and unguarded and painful to witness. Not quite joy, more like grief wearing joy's expression. And she ate 2 of them in quick succession and then said very quietly, "They're not the same as Mama's." "No," Clara said, "they're mine. They won't be the same." May considered this with the painful seriousness of a 7-year-old processing a hard truth. Then she said, "Okay," and ate a 3rd one. In the weeks that followed, Clara found 3 more notes from Ruth. They were distributed through the house in a way that suggested Ruth had placed them where she knew whoever came after would eventually look. Not obviously, not in plain sight, but in the places that a person maintaining a household would inevitably reach. One was tucked under the loose corner of the kitchen floorboard where the cold draft came up, with a note about how to seal it. One was folded inside the cover of the household accounts ledger, with a careful notation of which suppliers in town could be trusted and which would try to shortchange a woman on her own. One was wrapped around the handle of a particular cast iron pan, explaining that this pan was the one to use for the children's eggs, because it heated evenly and the others ran hot on the left side. Each one was the same, practical, precise, and written with the specific gravity of a person who knew their words had to carry weight. Clara read them all and replaced them carefully, and did not tell Silas. She wasn't sure if that was right. She thought about it. But the notes didn't feel like secrets exactly. They felt like gifts, like Ruth passing a lamp from one hand to another in the dark. And Clara had the sense that if she told Silas they existed, it would open something up in him that he wasn't ready for. She'd seen how he went still sometimes, briefly, when something in the house aligned with how it had been, when a meal came out right, when the children were settled and quiet. A fleeting stillness, like a man who had walked into a room and for 1/2 second forgotten what he'd come for, and then remembered and had to absorb that all over again. She was not trying to protect him. She didn't have that kind of claim on him. She was just watching, reading the geography of the place. And she could see where the soft ground was. The children were another matter. She was seeing them more clearly now, 3 weeks in. Nora had begun, imperceptibly, to relax. Not warmly. She was not a warm person by nature, and she'd been surviving too long on grit and efficiency to soften quickly. But she'd started talking to Clara in the evenings sometimes, not just relaying household information, but actual talking. About small things, about the farm, about a girl in town she'd been friends with before her mother died and whom she hadn't seen in months because trips to town were complicated now. "You should write to her," Clara said. "I wouldn't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything major. You could just say you've been thinking about her." Nora considered this with characteristic skepticism. What if she's moved on, made other friends? Then she'll write back and you'll know, and at least you'll know. A long pause. That's not particularly comforting. No, Clara agreed, but it's better than wondering. Nora did write the letter. She didn't show it to Clara, but Clara saw her seal it and add it to the pile of things going to town with Cobb. Thomas had stopped fighting the reading work. He wasn't sailing through it. The struggle was still there, and Clara suspected it would always require more from him than from other readers. But he'd developed a rhythm, and he was getting through material faster. More importantly, he'd stopped sitting with his shoulders hunched around his ears. He didn't look like he was bracing for failure every time he opened a book. One afternoon, he'd looked up from a page and said, apropos of nothing, "Do you think I'm stupid?" Clara had looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "I think you read differently than some people. Different isn't stupid, it's just different." He'd looked like he didn't entirely believe her, but he'd looked like he wanted to. It was on a Friday evening, the middle of her 4th week, that Silas did something unexpected. She was in the kitchen finishing the supper dishes when she heard the front door, which was unusual. He normally came in through the back. She heard him speak to Nora briefly in the hall, and then his boots on the stairs, going up rather than toward the kitchen. 15 minutes later, he came back down and into the kitchen, holding a small jar. "Jam," he said, setting it on the counter. "Cobb brought it from the Hendersons up the road. Mrs. Henderson makes it. There's enough for the week." He didn't explain why he was telling her this. He started to turn away. "Thank you," Clara said. He stopped, turned back slightly. "The children will like that," she said, "especially May." He nodded. Something about his jaw shifted. Not softening exactly, but the set of it changing from its default positioning of braced against things. "How is she doing?" he asked. "May." Clara dried her hands on her apron. She thought about the honest answer versus the reassuring one, and she gave him the honest one because she thought he was a man who needed honesty more than comfort. "She has days that are hard," Clara said. "Some mornings she wakes up, and for a minute she forgets. And then she remembers, and it hits her again fresh. Those are the worst mornings." She paused. "But she's been eating better this week, and she laughed yesterday. Really laughed at something Eli did. Actual laughing." She met his eyes. "That's real." He stood there with that information for a moment. "Eli?" he said. He balanced a spoon on his nose for approximately 4 minutes. I don't know how. Something happened in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the ghost of a muscle memory. "He used to do that for his mother," he said. "She'd pretend to be exasperated." "Did it work?" "Never," he said. "She always laughed." They stood in the kitchen in the particular quiet that settles after something true has been said. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Clara said. He looked at her with those pale, careful eyes, and she couldn't read what was in them, but she didn't look away. "She was," he said. He picked up his coffee cup and went back through the door to the sitting room, and Clara finished the dishes, and the house breathed around her in the dark. She had been at the Mercer Ranch for 1 month. She was not comfortable. Comfort was not the right word for what was happening. It was something more like fitting. The specific, incremental way a door settles into its frame after the house has shifted. Not forced, not frictionless, but finding the position where it sits right. She had not forgotten that this was temporary. She had not forgotten that she was contracted and compensated, and that in 11 months or thereabouts, a settlement would be made and she would leave. She told herself this clearly, regularly, the way you remind yourself of a practical fact that's easy to lose track of when you're busy. The ranch was beginning to look like a place that was cared for. Small things. The porch railing was fixed. Cobb had done it, but Clara had pointed out the loose boards, and she didn't think Cobb would have gotten to it on his own quite yet. The mending pile was gone. The root cellar seal had been fixed with a strip of oiled leather, and the temperature down there had stabilized enough to stop the turnips from softening. These were small things. They added up. Some mornings, coming down the stairs in the gray pre-dawn to start the fire and get the kitchen warm before anyone else was up, Clara would stand in the kitchen in the dark and feel something she didn't quite have language for. Not peace. She was not a peaceful person particularly. Not happiness. That word seemed too simple and too dishonest for what she was actually experiencing. More like purpose. The sense of being in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time, which was rarer than any happiness she'd ever chased and harder to explain. She would bank the fire and put the kettle on and go about the morning's work. But the feeling stayed, even after she'd moved past it. Outside, the Montana wind pushed at the windows, and the hills held their gray indifference. And inside the Mercer house, something that had been frozen for a very long time was beginning, in its own slow and reluctant way, to thaw. The jam lasted 4 days. May had eaten it with the focused dedication of someone performing a ritual, spreading it carefully on her bread each morning, as if the thickness of the layer required precise calculation. Eli had eaten his portion quickly and without ceremony, the way he did most things. Thomas had taken his without comment, which from Thomas was approximately the same as enthusiasm. On the 5th morning, when the jar came up empty and Clara set it aside to be washed, May looked at the jar for a long moment and then looked at Clara and said, "Can we get more?" "I'll ask Cobb to check with Mrs. Henderson next time he goes up that way," Clara said. May nodded, satisfied, and went back to her breakfast. It was the first time one of the children had asked Clara for something as if she were simply a permanent fixture in their lives, someone whose role it was to arrange things, to make the jam appear again. Not a stranger to be negotiated with, just someone who was there. Clara turned to the stove so no one would see her face. That small moment set the tone for the weeks that followed, though she wouldn't have been able to identify it as such in real time. The shift happened in increments too fine to mark. A word used here, a habit formed there, the household contracting and expanding around her presence until she stopped being something added to the equation and started being part of the equation itself. It was not comfortable, exactly. It was something closer to frightening. In a quiet way, she didn't let herself examine too carefully. She was not supposed to become indispensable. She knew better than that. She had been indispensable before, to households in Billings, in Miles City, to Edmund Hale's first wife before that woman's health had finally failed her, and Edmund had sent Clara somewhere else. Being indispensable was not the same as being wanted. She had learned that particular distinction early, and she'd learned it in the specific painful way you learn things that don't get absorbed by the brain the first time, because the heart keeps arguing against them. So she kept working. She kept doing what needed to be done, and she kept a careful accounting, in the back of her mind, of the 11 months remaining on the contract. The trouble was that the Mercer children were not making any of this easier. Nora had received a letter back from her friend in town, a girl named Jessie Parrish, whose family ran the hardware store on Caldwell Street. The letter was 2 pages long, which Nora showed Clara with studied casualness and a completely unconvincing pretense that she wasn't pleased about it. "She wants me to come visit," Nora said, "when the roads clear properly. She says her mother would put me up for a night if I wanted." "That sounds good," Clara said. "It would mean being away from the house for a full day, maybe 2. "I can manage the house for 2 days, Nora." Nora looked at her. The skepticism in it was still there, but it was wearing down at the edges, the way skepticism does when evidence keeps coming in against it. "I know you can," she said. I'm used to being the one who—" She stopped, started again. "I haven't left this property in 4 months." The weight of that sentence sat between them. "Write to Jessie," Clara said. "Pick a date. I'll make sure everything is sorted here." Nora folded the letter, carefully, along its original creases. "It's strange," she said after a moment, "feeling like I can." Clara didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't land wrong, and she knew it. The following Tuesday, Nora wrote a second letter to Jessie Parrish and added it to Cobb's pile for town. That same week, Thomas finished the McGuffey reader. He set it down on the kitchen table in front of Clara with a thud that contained multitudes, satisfaction, relief, and a residual defiance toward the thing for having made him work so hard. "Done," he said. "Good," she said. "What do I do now?" Clara looked at him. He was asking in the practical sense, meaning what book came next. But there was something else under the question. The particular anxiety of a person who has spent so long fighting through something hard that they've forgotten how to exist when that specific fight is over. "There's a copy of Robinson Crusoe on the shelf in the sitting room," she said. "Third shelf, left side, green cover. It's not a textbook, it's a story. There's a difference." He went and got it without being asked a second time. She heard him that evening in the sitting room, reading aloud quietly, finding his rhythm. The sound was oddly steadying, the murmur of a voice working through language and not losing. And then there was Sam. Sam was the one she thought about most in the quiet moments. Not because he demanded it. He was the least demanding presence in the household, moving through the days in his own careful orbit, touching things softly, arranging and rearranging his carved animals with a seriousness that suggested the arrangements meant something, even if no one else could decode the system. But there was something in the way he moved through the world that stayed with Clara in a way she couldn't entirely account for. He was so completely himself, so entirely unconcerned with performing his existence for anyone else's comfort. He communicated what he needed through gesture and proximity and the specific weight of his silences, and he had apparently decided sometime in the weeks since Clara arrived that she was safe enough to be near, because he had begun appearing in whatever room she was working in. He didn't interact with her most of the time. He just occupied the same space, brought his animals or a piece of wood he was examining, or sometimes just himself, and settled within roughly 6 feet of wherever she was working and stayed there. She worked around him. She didn't make a project of him, didn't address him more than she would have addressed anyone else in the room. One afternoon she was darning socks, a task she found tedious but meditative, which made it useful when she became aware that Sam was watching her hands. She kept working. He edged slightly closer. She kept working. He was close enough now that she could feel the small warmth of him, the particular quality of a child who has decided you're trustworthy and is in the process of acting on that decision. She held the sock and the darning egg out toward him without looking at him directly. He took the darning egg, turned it over in his hands. It was a smooth wooden oval, sanded to a good finish, and he ran his thumb across it with the focused attention he gave to most objects, that real, physical attention that some children have and most adults have drummed out of themselves. Then he handed it back. She took it, kept darning. After a while, he went back to his corner and his animals, and she went on with the socks. It was not a conversation. It was something that happened before conversations, the prior agreement, the establishing of terms. She had the feeling that Sam's terms were quite clear, and he kept them consistently, and if you met them, he met you back. She did not know what to do with how much that meant to her. The other development that 5th week was Silas. Not a dramatic development. Nothing announced itself. But she began to notice that he was present more in the evenings than he had been in her first weeks. Not hovering, not sociable exactly, but there. Sitting at the kitchen table with his accounts, coming through the sitting room when she was there with the children, occasionally stopping in a doorway with his coffee and not immediately continuing on. She didn't remark on it. She was not sure he was even aware of it himself. But one evening she was sitting at the kitchen table with the household accounts ledger. She'd discovered the previous week that the system Nora had been using to track expenses was accurate, but so idiosyncratic that she needed Ruth's original ledger to cross-reference. And she'd asked Silas for access to it, which he'd provided without question. And Silas came in for coffee and didn't leave. He stood at the counter and looked at what she was doing. "The Henderson invoice from October hasn't been settled," she said, without looking up. "Did they carry it forward, or was it an oversight?" "Oversight," he said. I'll get it to Cobb." A pause. "How are the numbers overall?" "Tight," she said honestly. "Not unmanageable. The spring will be better if the calving goes well, and the feed stores should last the winter if we're careful. Cobb says we lost 2 head in November to the cold snap. I saw the notation." She looked up. "Is that typical for a winter up here?" "Bad winter? Yes. Average, no." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was unusual. He generally remained standing, as if sitting invited a kind of conversation he wasn't prepared for. What Ruth would usually do is adjust the spring planning to compensate. She kept a kitchen garden, reduced the dependency on town through summer and fall. Claire processed this. Did she document the garden plan? In her planting journal. Should be somewhere in the study. "I don't go in the study," Claire said. He looked at her. "I said don't touch anything in the study. You could go in and look at a book." The distinction seemed unclear at the time. The corner of his mouth did something. It was less than a smile and more than nothing. "Fair point," he said. "I'll bring it out." He brought the planting journal the next morning, before she'd even started breakfast. Set it on the kitchen table and went back out without comment. She opened it over her coffee. Ruth's planting journal was dense and meticulous and occasionally funny in a dry, observational way that told Clara something about her that the practical notes hadn't fully conveyed. There were margin notations that were purely personal. A note that the beans on the east side did better because the twins are afraid of that corner since the spider incident and leave it alone. A comment that the pumpkins from the south bed were reliable and low maintenance, like a good neighbor, unlike the squash, which require constant attention and deliver inconsistently, like a bad one. Clara read through the whole journal before she started on breakfast. She was going to have to account for the time somehow, and she could only come up with "I was in the company of someone interesting," which was not an explanation she could give anyone. She thought about Ruth Mercer more than she knew was entirely wise. She thought about what it must have been like to build something like this house, this family, this collection of specific and difficult people who were all, in their different ways, extraordinary. And to know you were leaving it. She thought about the notes hidden through the house, the practical lamp passing in the dark, the planting journal with its margin jokes. She thought, you must have loved them so much. And she thought, how do you learn to stay when everything you've known tells you you're going to leave? These two thoughts had no particular connection to each other. She noticed them sitting in the same place and chose not to examine why. Nora came down to find her still sitting with the journal and gave her a look. Breakfast isn't started, she said. I know, Clara said. I'm starting it now. Nora looked at the journal. Something moved in her face, recognition, and then a careful blankness, the way someone looks when they're not ready to feel something. She kept good records, Clara said. I was thinking about the kitchen garden for spring. If we planted early, we could... She planted tomatoes along the south fence, Nora said. Her voice was flat, but not unfriendly. They did well there. Better than anywhere else she tried. I'll note that, Clara said. And she kept the mint in a separate bed because it runs. She'd have it everywhere otherwise. Good to know. Nora stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway, not quite entering, not quite leaving. She would have liked you, she said, finally. The words came out like she'd been carrying them for a while and had decided, without making much of it, to set them down. Mama, she liked people who were practical and didn't fuss. Clara did not trust herself to respond immediately. Thank you, she said, when she could. Nora nodded once, as if a transaction had been completed, and went to put the kettle on. The 6th week brought the first real cold of what Cobb grimly described as the actual winter settling in, as opposed to the introductory cold they'd been dealing with up to that point, which apparently had been merely a preview. The temperature dropped in a way that was less a weather event and more a philosophical statement. The wind off the northern hills took on a quality that wasn't just cold but actively hostile. The kind of wind that made you understand why the early settlers of this country had sometimes simply lain down and given up. Clara did not lie down and give up. She also did not pretend the cold was manageable. She tripled the amount of wood going into the box and reorganized the morning routine so that no child had to spend more than 3 minutes outside before the animals were checked and the paths were cleared. Silas looked at the revised schedule she'd posted on the kitchen board one morning and said, "You've taken Eli off the morning feed." Eli had frostbite on 2 fingers last winter, Clara said. Nora told me. His circulation is slow in the cold. I moved him to the afternoon check, which is 2 hours warmer. He looked at her. It was on the board already, she said. I kept the same tasks, just shifted the timing. It's fine, he said. But he stayed looking at the board for a moment, and she could see him recalibrating something. The recognition that this detail, his son's frostbite, his son's slow circulation in the cold, had been seen and responded to, not by him. He should have been wearing the heavier mittens all along, he said, and it came out rough-edged, not at her, at himself. He has been, this week, she said. I found a pair in the coat chest that fit him better. He's got them on now. Silas said nothing more and went out. She knew, because she was learning to read the specific geography of his face, that the silence was not indifference. It was a man absorbing information about his own children from someone who'd been in his house for 6 weeks, and finding the experience somewhere between humbling and unbearable, and dealing with it the only way he seemed able to deal with hard things, which was to walk out into the cold and work until he could breathe normally again. She didn't blame him for that. She had her own version of the same mechanism. She just cleaned things when she couldn't breathe normally, to each their own. Thomas came to her that same week with Robinson Crusoe finished and an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. What did you think? she asked. It was good, he said, carefully. That's it? He wrestled with himself briefly. I thought he was going to stay on the island, he said. At the end. I thought he'd built something there, and it made more sense to stay. Clara looked at him. He was 10 years old with ink on his fingers from the letters he'd been practicing, and he was talking about a man who had built a life in a place no one expected and then had to decide whether to leave it. Some people would say the island wasn't real life, she said. That going back was always the point. What do you think? She considered it honestly. I think the island became real to him, she said. And I think leaving something real is its own kind of loss, even when you're going somewhere better. Thomas was quiet, thinking this over with the focused seriousness he brought to things that mattered to him. He should have stayed, he said. It's what I would have done. She thought about that later, in the small hours before dawn when the house was still and she could hear the wind working at the eaves. She thought about islands and what made a place real. She thought about the fact that she had been in this house for 43 days, which was longer than she had stayed in several of the 7 households she'd moved through in 7 years, and that the thought of leaving it felt, for the first time in her life, like a loss rather than a reset. She turned over in the narrow bed and told herself firmly that this was not a productive line of thinking. The line of thinking persisted anyway. It was on a Thursday in that 6th week that she had her first real encounter with Silas's grief. Not the surface of it. She'd been brushing against that since the first evening, the careful blankness he wore like a second coat. She meant the interior of it, the actual structure, which turned out to be more complicated than simple loss. She'd gone into the study for the first time with his permission to retrieve the planting journal she'd returned to its shelf. He was there, which she hadn't expected. It was mid-morning, and he was usually out with Cobb by this hour. He was sitting at the desk with nothing in front of him. Not the accounts, not a letter, not a book. Just sitting, looking at a point on the wall that didn't appear to contain anything in particular. She almost backed out, but he'd heard the door. Sorry, she said. I just needed the journal. I'll... Come in, he said. His voice was its usual flat register, but there was something slowed in it. She came in, took the journal from the shelf, and would have left, but he spoke again. Today is the day we would have been married 13 years, he said. He said it like a fact being read from a ledger. I keep thinking I should be used to it by now, the day coming around. Clara stood in the middle of the study with the journal under her arm and said nothing because she didn't have anything useful to say, and she'd learned enough by now to know that he wasn't necessarily looking for something useful. She died in June, he said. So it's not like the day is close to... It's just the anniversary. He picked up a pen from the desk and turned it over in his fingers. I don't know what I expect to happen when it comes around. It just keeps surprising me every year. I imagine it does, she said. I imagine grief has its own calendar and doesn't particularly care about yours. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not quite cracking, but loosening. The way ice does in the first weeks of thaw, when you can't quite see it happening, but the sound changes. She'd have wanted me to do something today, he said. She believed in marking things. Anniversaries, birthdays, first days of seasons. She thought if you didn't mark something, it would blur together with everything else and you'd lose it. He set the pen down. I haven't been marking anything. What would she have wanted you to do today? Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment. Take the children somewhere, he said. She liked to take them up to the ridge west of the property on clear days. You can see for a long way from up there. Is today clear? He looked at the window. It was clear, cold and iron bright, but clear. It'll be cold, he said. I'll make sure everyone has the right things on. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not quite disbelief, not quite gratitude, not quite either of those things. I haven't done that since... He stopped. The children might like it, she said carefully, or they might not, but either way, you'd have tried. She left him with that and went to get everyone's coats. An hour later, all 7 of them, Silas, Clara, Nora, Thomas, the twins, and Sam, made the half-mile walk up the ridge west of the property. Sam held Clara's hand for the first 10 minutes and then let go when the terrain evened out, conducting the walk independently but staying within 2 feet of her left side. Eli slipped twice and pretended he hadn't. May complained about the cold for approximately 4 minutes. and then forgot she was cold when a hawk moved over the valley below them and she saw it. From the top of the ridge, the land spread out enormous and undifferentiated and beautiful, in the way that places are beautiful when they stop pretending to care about you and just exist. You could see 3 ranges of hills. You could see the river, thin and silver in the winter light, moving in a long arc through the valley. You could see how far away everything was from everything else up here, and how that distance was not loneliness exactly, but something more neutral, space, just space, in every direction. They stood up there for nearly 40 minutes. Silas didn't say much, but he wasn't in the braced, compressed posture he usually wore. He was just standing in the cold and looking at the land, and once he said something quiet to Nora, and she said something back, and their breath made brief clouds in the air. Thomas stood next to Clara and looked at the horizon. "Do you think that's Canada up there?" he said. "Probably," she said. "More or less." "What's different there?" She thought about it. "Colder, I think. And they say sorry a lot more." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. On the way down, May put her hand in Silas's, which clearly startled him. He looked down at her small hand in his with the expression of a man encountering something he'd forgotten was possible. And then his hand closed around hers, and they walked down the ridge together. Clara walked behind them, Sam still at her side, and the hawk was still out there somewhere, tilting on the cold thermals, and she was very careful not to feel too much about any of it. The second month passed into the third. February had come in, and the ranch had found something like a rhythm, rough-edged and imperfect and human, but a rhythm nonetheless. Clara learned which beams in the barn creaked when the temperature dropped. She learned that Thomas had a habit of leaving things exactly 1 inch from where they should be, cups not quite pushed back from the counter edge, chairs not quite pushed in, and that this was not carelessness, but some form of private preference she'd decided not to address. She learned that Silas drank his coffee too hot and too fast every morning, as if he needed the shock of it, and then walked outside and stood in the cold for 2 minutes before he could start work, which she eventually understood was less about the cold and more about needing the transition. She learned that Nora sang quietly when she thought no one could hear her. She found this out one afternoon when she was coming up the back stairs from the root cellar and heard it through the kitchen door, a low, unself-conscious sound, not performing a song so much as thinking one, running a melody through her mind while her hands were busy with something else. Clara stood on the stairs and didn't go through the door, just listened for a moment. When she came in, Nora stopped immediately and didn't acknowledge that anything had happened. Clara got a cup of water and said, "What was that?" "The tune." A pause. "Our mother used to sing it," Nora said without looking up. "I don't remember the words anymore, just the melody." "It's pretty," Clara said. Nora's jaw tightened. "Don't make it a thing," she said. "I'm not making it a thing," Clara said. "I said it was pretty." Nora was quiet. Then, conceding something, she said, "She had a good voice, better than mine." "Did she sing a lot?" "In the kitchen," Nora said, "when she was working, not for an audience, just while she was doing things." Clara put her cup in the wash basin. "That's the best kind of singing," she said. She went back to work. Behind her, after a few minutes, she heard the melody start up again, very quietly. She didn't mention it. The shift she'd been watching for started about 3 weeks later, in early February, in a way she hadn't expected. It started with Silas not leaving after supper. He'd been sitting in the kitchen for longer in the evenings. She'd noticed that, and she'd been careful not to notice it too obviously or to arrange herself in any particular way in response to it. But he had always, until that point, removed himself to the study or to bed at a reliable hour, as if he had timed his own presence in common spaces with a stopwatch and stuck to the schedule. On a Tuesday evening, the twins in bed, Thomas reading in the sitting room, Nora upstairs writing another letter to Jessie Parrish, Sam asleep, always asleep earliest, and most deeply of all the children, Silas sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his accounts, and then he set the accounts aside and just sat there while Clara finished cleaning up. She was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, not because you're looking at it, but because the air pressure changes. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She turned. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his coffee cup, turning it in his hands in the way he'd turned the pen in the study that day. "Yes," she said. What made you say yes to the contract when Hale offered it? She thought about this. She could have given the easy answer. She'd had no real choice in the matter, which was true, but she got the sense from the way he'd asked it that it wasn't the answer he was looking for. I thought it was better than the alternative, she said, which was staying where I was and pretending I didn't see what was happening. She dried her hands. And I thought, even then, before I knew anything about this place, that 5 children needed someone who was going to be honest with them. Not just useful. Honest. He looked at her then. Have you been? He said. Honest with them. I've tried, she said. Thomas didn't need to be told he was smart. He needed to be told the truth about why it was hard. May didn't need to be told everything was going to be fine. She needed to be told she was allowed to feel terrible and still eat breakfast. She paused. I think children know when you're lying to protect them, and it makes the world feel less stable, not more. He was quiet for a long time. I told them it was going to be fine, he said. After Ruth died. I told them... He stopped, started again. I didn't know what else to say. I know, she said. That's not a criticism. No, but it's... I should have... He put the coffee down. His hands were flat on the table now, not moving. Nora stepped in because I couldn't. Sam stopped talking. Thomas started closing off. And I was right there, every day. And I missed it. I missed what was happening to them. The silence in the kitchen was not comfortable, but it was honest, and she didn't try to fill it. You haven't missed it, she said. You've been watching. You walked up to the ridge with them. You fixed the porch railing because you didn't want May tripping on it. You moved Eli's chores when you found out about the frostbite. You moved them yourself the next morning before I'd even mentioned it to you. He looked at her sharply. I saw the board, she said simply. You'd already adjusted it. He said nothing. You haven't missed it, she said again. You just didn't know how to help with it. That's different. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it should have, given the distance across the table, and she felt the particular specific discomfort of a person whose careful interior accounting is being reviewed by someone else without their full permission. You have a way of saying difficult things plainly, he said. That doesn't make them easy, but they're easier. I've had a lot of practice, she said. 7 households, he said. 7 households, she agreed. He picked up his coffee, which was cold by now, and he drank it anyway. And they sat in the kitchen for a while in a silence that was, for the first time since she had arrived at this particular address, uncomplicated. She did not examine what that meant. She told herself she didn't. By the beginning of the 8th week, the planting journal was annotated with her own notes in the margins, alongside Ruth's. She had not planned to write in it, but at some point she'd picked up a pencil to mark something, and it seemed disrespectful to start a separate sheet of paper when the relevant context was right there. So her handwriting was now in the margins of Ruth's planting journal, smaller than Ruth's, less assured but legible. She noticed this one morning and sat with the discomfort of it. Nora came in, saw what she was looking at, and said, You've been writing in it. I know, Clara said. I'm sorry, I should have... No, Nora said. She looked at the journal open on the table, at the 2 different sets of handwriting in the margins. Her face did the complicated thing it sometimes did, the thing that was processing something too large for a simple expression. No, it should have notes in it. She'd have wanted it to have notes in it. She'd have been furious if it just sat there being a monument. Monuments aren't very useful, Clara said. No, Nora said. She'd have said exactly that. She closed the journal gently, her hand resting on the cover for just a moment, and then she went to the stove and started the morning water, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary noise of morning, and outside the Montana cold held on to the last weeks of February with the grip of something that doesn't know when to let go. Clara watched the light come up through the kitchen window, the slow gray-pink rise of it over the hills, and did not let herself think forward. She had 9 more months on the contract. She had work to do. That was the accounting. She kept it in front of her. But under it, like the water in the root cellar that the cold seal was now holding back, was the other accounting fact, the one she couldn't fully shut out, which was that she was starting to know what belonging felt like for the first time in her life. And she had absolutely no idea what to do about that. March came in like something that had a grudge. The temperature had been dropping steadily through the last week of February, settling into a cold so persistent that it stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like the natural condition of the world, as if warmth were the aberration and this bladed, bone-gray cold was simply what existed. The horses moved less. The barn cats, which normally prowled the perimeter with professional disregard for comfort, had taken up permanent residence in the hayloft. Even Cobb, who had 11 winters on this ranch and had never once in Clara's hearing complained about the cold, said one morning over his coffee that this one felt different. Different how? Clara asked. He looked out the window at the sky, a sky the color of old pewter, low and featureless in a way that made the horizon feel closer than it was. Waiting, he said, the way things wait before they move. She thought about that for 2 days. On the third day, the blizzard hit. It didn't build up gradually the way storms sometimes did, giving you time to count the clouds and make decisions. It arrived in the early afternoon with the sudden, totalizing logic of something that doesn't negotiate. The temperature dropping another 8 degrees in under an hour, the wind coming off the northern range in long, horizontal waves that turned the snow sideways, reducing visibility in the yard to roughly 30 feet. Within 20 minutes of its arrival, the world beyond the porch had effectively ceased to exist. There was the house, there was whatever was immediately adjacent to the house, and there was the white, roaring nothing beyond that. Clara had brought in 3 loads of extra wood that morning. She didn't know why. Some instinct she hadn't put a name to, the same one that had made her check the pantry stocks the previous afternoon and make sure the water was drawn. Cobb had looked at her when she hauled the second load and said, "You feel it too." And she'd said she didn't know what she felt, which was true, and kept working. Silas and Cobb were in the barn when it hit. She knew that. She had seen them heading out after the midday meal. The barn was 60 yards from the house, which in normal conditions was a nothing distance. But 60 yards in a full whiteout was a different kind of mathematics. She watched the yard from the kitchen window and waited for them to come back. The children were in the house. Nora was at the table mending. Thomas was in the sitting room with his book. May and Eli were upstairs playing something loud enough to hear through the floor, but not loud enough to be alarmed about. Sam was in the corner of the kitchen, arranged on the floor with his animals, paying the storm no apparent attention. Clara did a head count without being obvious about it. 5 children, Silas in the barn, Cobb in the barn. She put more wood on the kitchen fire and checked the temperature of the sitting room. Cold was beginning to press through the north-facing windows. She stuffed the gap under the front door with a rolled strip of wool she'd cut for exactly this kind of situation. She'd done it 2 weeks ago, during a cold snap, and hadn't removed it, and went back to the kitchen. An hour passed. Nora said, without looking up from her mending, "Papa should be back by now." "The barn's solid," Clara said. "He and Cobb will wait it out there if they need to. They know the ranch." "I know," Nora said. But the mending had slowed, and she was looking at the window more than the needle. It was another 40 minutes before Clara realized Eli was not upstairs. She noticed it because May came down alone, something unusual, because the twins tended to move as a unit, and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be casual and not quite managing it, "Eli went to look for Papa." The room went still. Clara turned from the stove. "When?" "Maybe—" May's face was pale beneath the freckles. "Maybe 20 minutes ago. He said he was going to the barn to tell Papa to come in for supper. I told him to wait, but he said it wasn't that far." 60 yards and a full whiteout. Clara was already moving toward the coat hooks. She pulled her heaviest coat off the hook and shrugged into it, not looking away from May. "Did he take his mittens, the heavy ones?" "I don't know. I don't think—" "His scarf." May was crying now, silently, in the particular terrible way of a child who is frightened and knows that crying isn't useful but can't stop. "I don't know, Clara, I don't—" "It's all right," Clara said, which was not exactly true, but was the thing May needed in that moment. She wrapped her own scarf twice around her neck and pulled her hat down. "Nora, keep everyone inside. Keep the fire going. Don't open the front door." Nora had gone white. "You can't go out in that." "I can. I just have to be careful." She found the coil of rope Silas kept by the back door. She'd noticed it her first week and filed it away. And she thought for a second. 60 yards. If she tied one end to the porch post and paid out the line as she walked, she could follow it back. The rope was maybe 40 yards. Not enough. She grabbed it anyway because some rope was better than none, and she went out the back door. The cold hit her like something physical, not wind so much as force, like being shoved by something with no hands. The snow was horizontal, and within 3 seconds she couldn't see the barn and could barely see the porch railing 2 feet away. She tied the rope end around the porch post with hands that were already stiffening, pulled her scarf up over her mouth and nose, and started across the yard. She kept her head down and her eyes narrowed to slits. The ground was still visible just below her, brown-gray with snow piling in the hollows, and she could navigate by feel as much as sight, knowing the yard's topography the way she'd learned it over 2 months of daily crossing. 14 steps to the water trough, bare left around it. Another 20 to the fence post. The barn would be 20 yards from there. The rope played out. She let it go at the end. She'd gone too far to turn back, and it wasn't helping her forward, and pushed on through the white. She heard Eli before she saw him. He wasn't crying. He was doing something worse. Standing completely still in the snow, about 8 yards from the barn door, in the specific frozen way of a child who has realized they are in serious trouble and has stopped moving because stopping felt safer than moving in any direction. He'd lost his hat. His ears were a color they shouldn't be. He was shaking badly. Eli! She got to him, grabbed his arms. He looked up at her. His face was shocked blank. I couldn't see, he said. I couldn't see anything. I know. I've got you. She pulled his arms around her, turned him toward the barn, and pushed the last 8 yards. The barn door opened before she reached it. Silas was in the doorway. His face, she'd never seen that expression on him before. It was fear, undisguised, stripped of every bit of the careful management he normally kept over his expressions. He took Eli from her arms before she'd fully stopped moving, pulled the boy against him, and held on. I'm okay, Papa, Eli said into his coat. Clara came. Silas looked at Clara over his son's head. His eyes were doing something she couldn't read. Too much in them at once. Fear resolving into relief, resolving into something else she didn't have a name for. Get inside, he said. Both of you, she said. His ears need warming, slowly, not by the fire directly. They got inside the barn. Cobb was there, and he took one look at the situation and started running his own hands, rough and warm from the work, along Eli's ears and cheeks, the right way to do it, pressing warmth back in without the shock of direct heat. The boy was shaking, but his color was coming back. Clara leaned against the barn wall and breathed. Her own hands were past cold. They were in the territory past cold where you stopped feeling them properly and had to think consciously about opening and closing the fingers. She did that now, methodically, opening and closing, keeping the blood moving. Silas was watching her. You went out in that, he said, and it came out wrong. Not accusatory, but stripped of his usual modulation, raw. You didn't know where he was. I had a general direction, she said. Clara. He said her name the way you say a word when you realize you've almost lost it, and you're verifying it's still there. He's fine, she said. He'll be fine. His ears will be sore for a day. He won't do it again. No, Eli said firmly from Cobb's hands. I won't. They stayed in the barn. The storm showed no intention of pausing for them. It was warmer in the barn than outside. The animals generated heat, and Cobb had closed everything up tight before the worst of it arrived. Silas found a lantern and got it lit. The 4 of them settled into the hay. It was an odd collection. The rancher, the hired girl, the old hand, the 7-year-old who'd nearly killed himself through pure twin stubbornness. And after the first half hour, when the adrenaline had worked its way out and the practical business of waiting was all that was left, the conversation that happened between them was not planned and not careful, and therefore was the most honest conversation Clara had been present for since she'd arrived at the ranch. It started with Eli, because Eli was a child, and children don't know when not to talk. Are you and Clara friends? He asked Silas. Silas looked at Eli, then at Clara. We work together, he said, but you talk a lot at night, at the table. That's work talk, Silas said, in a tone that suggested this conversation was going in a direction he'd have preferred to avoid. It doesn't sound like work talk, Eli said. He was warming up now, the color fully back in his face, and with the color had come back his complete inability to read the room. It sounds like how you used to talk to Mama when I was little, Before. The barn was very quiet, except for the storm. Cobb suddenly found something very interesting to look at in the middle distance. Clara looked at her hands. Silas said, "You should sleep if you can. It's going to be a while before we can cross back." Eli opened his mouth. "Sleep, Eli." Eli closed his mouth. He lasted about 4 minutes before his eyes shut and his breathing evened out, the way children can sleep, instantly, completely, as if consciousness is a light switch. Cobb shifted in the hay, stood up, and said he was going to check on the horses. The horses were 12 feet away and had not moved. He went to check on them anyway. That left Claire and Silas in the lantern light, with the storm at the walls and Eli asleep between them and Cobb performing the most transparent exit in ranch history. She didn't look at him. She was watching her hands, flexing them slowly. "They're still cold," he said. "They're coming back. Let me—" He reached across Eli and, without making much of it, took her hands in his. His were work-roughened and warm in the specific way of hands that spend time outdoors. Not soft warmth, but real warmth, the kind you can feel in the bone. He held them, not moving, just held them. She did not pull away. She also did not look at him. They both maintained the polite fiction that this was entirely practical. "What Eli said," he started, and then stopped. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't," he said. "That's not why I'm—" He stopped again. He was not a man who fumbled normally, and the fumbling was its own kind of information. "I'm not good at this. It's saying things that don't have a specific purpose." "I noticed," she said. "Clara." She looked at him. His face in the lantern light was doing the honest thing it did sometimes when he wasn't braced. The careful management was down. The storm had shaken it loose, and Eli's near catastrophe had knocked it the rest of the way. He looked like a man who was very tired of carrying a particular weight and hadn't yet decided whether to set it down. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "With any of this. With you in the house. With the children. With—" He shook his head. "I know the contract. I know what I offered. I meant it when I said it." "I know you did," she said quietly. "But I also—" His jaw tightened. "I find myself thinking about November. About the end of it." He looked down at their hands, which he was still holding. "And I don't think about it the way I should." She was very still. "I shouldn't be saying this," he said. "Probably not," she agreed. "But you went out in a blizzard after my son," he said, "with a piece of rope and no particular plan, and I—" He stopped. "I don't know how to not say it." "Silas? What?" "Your son is asleep between us," she said, "and the storm hasn't stopped, and I'm fairly sure Cobb is listening from over there." From the direction of the horses came a pointed silence that was distinctly human in character. Something shifted in Silas's face, and for the first time since she'd known him, something that was fully and unmistakably a smile broke through. Not a memory of one, not the ghost of a muscle movement, an actual smile, reluctant and crooked and real. "Cobb," he said. "Yep," Cobb said immediately. "You're fired." "Yep," Cobb said, in a tone that indicated he had been fired in this manner approximately 30 times and remained unconcerned. Clara felt something let go in her chest, some tight, contracted thing she hadn't known she'd been holding, and she almost laughed. Almost. She pressed her lips together and looked at the hay and did not laugh, because Eli was sleeping and because laughing in that moment would have opened something up, and she wasn't ready. But the almost laugh was there, and she thought he saw it, because he looked at her with something in his face that she felt throughout her whole body in a way that she resolutely filed away for later when she could afford to look at it. Silas did not say anything else. Neither did she. He kept her hands warm until they were fully her hands again, and then he let them go. And the storm held the four of them in the barn until after dark, when it finally eased enough that they could cross the yard with a lantern between them. The family met them at the back door. Nora had Sam by the hand and May by the shoulder, and when she saw Eli, she went through several distinct emotions in rapid sequence that she didn't bother to conceal, ending on a fierce embrace that Eli bore with the patience of a boy who knew he'd caused trouble and was paying the appropriate tax. "I told you to wait," May said, behind Nora. "I know," Eli said. "You were right. Please don't keep saying so." They ate late that night, a simple meal, everything warm, the kitchen fire built higher than usual. The children were subdued in the specific way of a family that has been frightened and is now processing the relief of being gathered back together. Sam ate beside Clara and pressed his foot against hers under the table, a small, warm pressure, and left it there. She pressed back. The storm continued through the night, but its worst was over. By morning, it had dropped to something manageable. Still cold, still blowing, but no longer the kind of thing that erased the world. The yard emerged from it in stages, the outlines coming back first and then the details. The barn reappearing at 60 yards like a fact reasserting itself. In the first full week after the blizzard, the house had a different character. Something had shifted in it. Not dramatically, not in ways that anyone named directly, but present in the way that changes are present when they've moved something fundamental. Silas was different, not transformed. She was not telling herself that story. She knew better. He was still quiet, still reserved, still the man who walked out into the cold every morning as a form of transition ritual. But the space between him and the rest of the household had changed its quality. He was closer to it, more present in the evenings. He sat with Thomas sometimes after supper, asking about the book, which had moved on from Crusoe to a collection of American history that Clara had found in the study and thought Thomas would like. He was right about that. He helped May with the arithmetic she'd been working on, which she'd been avoiding because she associated schoolwork with the life they'd had before, when Ruth had taught them all at the kitchen table, and the avoidance had been its own kind of grief. Silas sat with her patiently in a way that Clara could see cost him something, because the association was the same for him, but he sat with her. He did not speak again about what he'd said in the barn. Clara did not expect him to. She turned it over in her own mind privately and told herself all the practical things. 11 months on the contract, not 9. His family, not hers. A man still in the middle of his grief, not at the end of it. All of these were true. All of them were also beside the point in a way she was having increasing difficulty arguing against. The second crisis came 17 days after the blizzard, and it came without warning, the way the worst things do. May woke up sick. Not the ordinary sick of winter. A cold, a cough, the manageable miseries. Clara knew within 20 minutes of going to her room that morning that this was different. The child was burning. Not the low fever of a body fighting something minor, but the high, aggressive fever of a body in serious trouble. May's eyes were glassy, her breathing shallow, and when Clara put her hand on May's cheek, it came away feeling scorched. She went directly to Silas. He was at the table with his coffee, not yet out for morning chores, and she came into the kitchen and said without preamble, "May has a high fever. It's not minor. She needs a doctor." He was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. He went up to May's room and Clara followed, and he stood over his daughter's bed with an expression that was nothing like the managed blankness she'd learned in her first weeks. This was fear, plain and clean and terrible, and she didn't look away from it because she thought he needed to know it was seen. "How high?" he said. "Very." She put her hand on May's forehead again. The child stirred slightly, whimpered, settled back into the heat-thick sleep. "She needs Dr. Bauer, today. The roads are bad from the storm." "I know." He looked at her. "How bad?" she asked. "The main road to town is drifted. Cobb broke a trail 2 days ago with the sled, but it was rough going and it'll have drifted back in places." He was already calculating. She could see him doing it, the same look he had over the accounts. Distance, condition, time. A horse could get through. Sled might be faster. Which is faster? Horse, if you're riding hard. The sled is more stable but slower. "Then I'll ride," she said. He stared at her. "You'll ride." "I can ride well enough," she said. "Better than well enough." "Which horse?" "I'm going," he said. "Silas." She kept her voice steady, not argumentative. "If you go, there's no one here who can manage a high fever in a child. Nora's 15. You're the only one who knows what to do if it gets worse while you're gone. I know you know because I've seen how you handle the animals when they're sick, and it's the same knowledge." She paused. "I need to be the one to go." He looked at his daughter. May's chest was moving too quickly, shallow breaths, color wrong. He looked back at Clara. "The gray," he said. "Her name is Scout. She'll go as fast as you ask, but keep contact with her head. She spooks on the left side in bad conditions. 14 miles to town. Dr. Bauer's office is on the main street, left side when you're coming in. Red door. If he's not there, his wife will know where he is. 14 miles, she said. I'll be back inside 3 hours. She was in the barn and on scout in 8 minutes. The ride was not a ride she would ever describe in flattering terms. The road was exactly what Silas had said. Drifted in places, broken trail in others, the horse having to work through sections of snow that came up to her knees. Clara kept low, kept contact, kept talking to Scout in a low and continuous murmur that was as much for herself as for the horse. The cold was not as extreme as the blizzard, but it was cold enough, and 14 miles of it required a focused and deliberate relationship with discomfort, the choice to feel it and keep moving rather than the choice to feel it and stop. She thought about May's face, the glassy eyes, the too fast breathing. She rode harder. She made it to Millhaven in an hour and 40 minutes. Found the red door on the main street, left side, exactly where Silas had said. Dr. Bauer was there. An older man, solid and unhurried in the way of someone who had been handling emergencies for 30 years and had made peace with the fact that panic didn't help them. She told him May's symptoms in rapid, precise sentences. He listened, asked 3 questions, and was packing his bag before she'd finished answering the third one. Mercer Ranch, he said. Silas Mercer's girl. Yes. I'll take my own horse. You've ridden hard. Your animal needs rest. 10 minutes at least. Water her at the trough out front. He paused. You did the right thing coming fast. High fever in a child that age, it's not something to wait on. He said it matter-of-factly, not to comfort her. She appreciated that. She watered Scout, gave her 10 minutes, and rode back. She arrived at the ranch 30 minutes behind Dr. Bauer, who had taken the route he knew and made better time through the difficult sections. By the time she got Scout unsaddled and came into the house, he was already upstairs with May. The kitchen had a quality she recognized. The specific tension of a household waiting for information, every person in it occupying their own small territory and not quite able to be still within it. Nora was at the stove with the kettle. Thomas was in the doorway. Eli was sitting at the table with both hands flat on the surface, as if he needed to feel something solid. Sam was beside Clara almost immediately. She hadn't seen him cross the room, but his hand found hers. Silas came down from upstairs 20 minutes later. His face told her something before his words did. It's bad, he said, but Bauer thinks we've caught it in time. She needs to come down in temperature and stay down. He's staying through the night. Nora exhaled slowly. Thomas's shoulders dropped 3 inches. Eli said, She'll be okay? Bauer thinks so, Silas said, if she comes down by morning. He looked at Clara. His face was doing the unguarded thing again. What's all the management down? What was under it was complicated and not something she could have named in a single word. You made it in under 2 hours, he said. Scout is fast. Clara. She's going to be fine, she said. She will be. He nodded once and looked at his children, and then he went back upstairs to sit with his daughter. Clara made coffee. She made soup. She kept the fire going and the house warm and the kettle hot, and she managed the other children through the long evening and into the night, getting Eli and Sam to bed, staying up with Nora, who was too frightened to sleep and too proud to say so, sitting at the kitchen table together in the quiet hours and not talking much, which was sometimes better than talking. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, Nora put her head down on her arms and fell asleep at the table. Clara put a blanket over her shoulders and left her there. She was banking the kitchen fire at 4 in the morning when Silas came downstairs. His face was different, still tired, exhausted really, but the specific tight quality was gone. Fever broke, he said. Clara stopped moving. About an hour ago. It broke and she's sleeping properly now. He leaned against the doorframe. He looked like a man who had been holding himself up by will for the past 14 hours and was now negotiating with the wall for assistance. Bauer says she'll need a week of rest. She'll be weak, but she'll be all right. Clara sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't mean to. Her legs just made the decision without consulting her, and she sat down and she put her hand over her face for approximately 10 seconds. Hey, he said. She took her hand away. Her eyes were dry. She hadn't cried. She almost never cried. It wasn't that kind of reaction she was having. She was just recalibrating, just finding the floor again. Good, she said. That's good. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. He poured coffee from the pot she'd kept warm. It was old and strong and probably terrible, but he drank it without comment. "You rode 14 miles in a blizzard's aftermath to get the doctor," he said. "You came back the same way. You kept my children calm through the night." He set the cup down. "And now you're sitting there like you've done nothing in particular." "I haven't done anything you wouldn't have done," she said. "Clara," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that wasn't anger. She looked at him. "You have become—" He stopped, tried again. "This family—" Stopped again. He pressed his hand flat on the table between them and looked at it, like the right words might be written there if he looked long enough. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I know." He looked up at her. "I want to. I'm just not—" He exhaled. "I'm not good at it. I've never been good at it, even when I had more— when things were—" A pause. "Ruth used to say I communicated in subtext and expect everyone to understand me perfectly." "She wasn't wrong," Clara said. Something very close to a real laugh came out of him. Short, surprised, real. "No," he said. "She wasn't." They sat in the kitchen in the 4 o'clock dark, the fire settled and steady, the house breathing around them, 5 children sleeping in their rooms, and a doctor dozing in a chair upstairs next to a little girl who was going to be all right. Clara looked at her coffee cup. She thought about 9 months left on the contract. She thought about how the number didn't feel the way it used to feel, like a fixed point, a boundary, a thing to hold on to. It felt instead like a problem she didn't yet know how to solve. She thought about what Thomas had said about Crusoe. "He should have stayed. It's what I would have done." She thought about Ruth Mercer's handwriting in the margins of the planting journal, and her own handwriting alongside it. She thought about Sam's foot pressing against hers under the table, steady and warm. Outside, the Montana dark was beginning its slow retreat toward morning. The hills were still invisible, but somewhere out there behind the black they existed, patient and enormous and completely indifferent. By the time the light came up, May Mercer would be sleeping normally in her bed, the fever broken, the crisis past. And Clara Bellamy, who had never in her life made a plan that extended past the next household, sat in a kitchen that was starting to feel like the one she'd always been looking for, and found that she had no idea what to do with that, and that not knowing what to do with it felt, strangely and terrifyingly, a lot like hope. May recovered slowly, the way children do when a high fever has wrung them out. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small daily increments that were measurable if you watched closely. The first 2 days she slept more than she was awake. By the 3rd day she was sitting up and asking for soup with the particular imperious energy of a sick child who has realized she has leverage. By the 5th day she was complaining about staying in bed, which doctor Bauer had said would be the reliable indicator that she was genuinely on the mend, and which proved accurate. Clara brought her meals on a tray and read to her in the afternoons. Not the McGuffey readers, not anything improving, but a collection of folk stories she'd found on the sitting room shelf. The kind with animals that talked and people who made foolish bargains and geography that didn't correspond to any real place. May listened with the focused, slightly critical attention of someone who had opinions about narrative logic. And she did have opinions, and she voiced them, and it was the most sustained conversation Clara had managed to have with her. "That doesn't make sense," May said, halfway through a story about a girl who traded her shadow for a warm winter. "Why would she do that?" "A shadow doesn't keep you warm." "She wanted the warmth more than she thought about what she'd lose," Clara said. "But you'd notice," May said. "You'd notice immediately when it was gone. You'd feel wrong." Maybe she thought she'd get used to it. May considered this with genuine skepticism. "I don't think you get used to missing parts of yourself," she said. "I think you just find ways not to look." Clara looked at the 7-year-old in the bed with the quilt pulled up to her chin and thought that grief had done something interesting to May Mercer's mind, had cut a channel in it that went deeper than most children's ran. "You might be right," she said. "I usually am," May said, with a composure that was so purely Nora that Clara had to look away to keep from smiling. The weeks following May's illness had a different texture to them, softer in some places, more complicated in others. The close call had shaken something loose in the household, the way a near miss on the road makes you drive differently for a while, more alert to the distance between ordinary and catastrophic. The children were gentler with each other for a time. Silas was present in the evenings in a way that was no longer tentative. He was simply there, at the table or in the sitting room, a reliable presence rather than an occasional one. He and Clara had not spoken again about what had passed between them in the barn during the blizzard or in the kitchen at 4 in the morning after May's fever broke. The words that had been said, or almost said, or said in the spaces between sentences, sat in the house like something both of them were navigating around carefully, with the particular caution of people who know that naming a thing changes it and aren't certain they're ready for it to change. She watched him with the children and saw something she hadn't seen in her first weeks. Not the guilt-ridden distance of a man who believed he'd failed his family, but the effortful, imperfect presence of a man trying to be better at being there. He made mistakes at it. He misjudged Nora's mood sometimes and said the wrong thing. He pushed Thomas too hard one afternoon about the arithmetic, and Thomas went quiet in the way that meant he was hurt, and it took Silas a full day to work out what he'd done wrong and go back and repair it. He wasn't smooth at any of this. He was working at it, visibly, with the same focused and slightly grudging effort he brought to any problem that mattered to him. Clara found that more reassuring than smooth would have been. She found a lot of things about him more reassuring than she'd intended to. It was in the last week of March that the letter arrived. Cobb brought it with the other mail from town. A small stack that included seed catalogs Clara had sent away for, a letter from Jesse Parrish to Nora, and a business envelope addressed to Clara in handwriting she recognized immediately and wished she didn't. Edmund Hale's handwriting was precise and controlled, the handwriting of a man who had thought carefully about every letter before committing it to paper. She waited until she was alone in the kitchen to open it. It was not a long letter. Edmund Hale was not a man who used more words than necessary. He said that he would be passing through the territory on business in mid-April and intended to stop at the ranch to check on her situation. He said that Patricia, his wife, Clara's effective replacement in the Hale household, had family in a town 3 hours south, which was the proximate reason for the journey. He said he hoped she was finding the position manageable. He also said, in the final paragraph, that he had been giving thought to her future arrangements and that there were other options he wished to discuss with her. Options that, in his assessment, would provide a more stable foundation than a temporary contract on a struggling ranch. Clara read the final paragraph twice. She folded the letter back into the envelope and put it in her apron pocket and went about finishing the supper preparation, and she did not say anything to anyone about it that evening. But she took it out again that night, in the narrow room at the end of the hall, and read it a third time. More stable foundation, temporary contract. The words were correct, technically. The contract was temporary. The ranch had been struggling when she arrived, though it was less so now. Edmund Hale was not saying anything factually wrong. She had the feeling, reading it, of someone reaching into the life she'd been building here, however carefully, however provisionally, and taking hold of it with both hands to remind her it could be picked up and moved. She put the letter in the drawer of the bedside table and did not sleep well. She didn't tell Silas. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, which she knew even as she told herself this was not entirely true. What she was actually doing was trying to determine first how she felt about it, whether she wanted Edmund Hale's visit or feared it, whether his offer of other options was a lifeline or an intrusion. And she couldn't determine how she felt because her feelings about this were, for the first time in recent memory, completely tangled up in other people, not just any other people. These people. This specific, difficult, slowly healing collection of people in this particular cold house in northern Montana. Nora found the envelope 3 days later, not the letter itself, that was still in the drawer, but the envelope which Clara had left on the kitchen windowsill without thinking about it, and which Nora picked up to move when she was wiping down the sill and recognized the return address. Edmund Hale, she said. Not a question. My guardian, Clara said. Former guardian. Nora set the envelope down. What did he want? He's passing through the territory next month. He wants to stop in. Nora looked at her. She had her mother's capacity for reading a room, Clara had come to understand. The ability to know when the stated information was not the full information. What else? She said. Clara decided that Nora was 15 years old and had been running this household and managing her father's grief and her siblings' varied crises for the better part of a year, and she deserved a straight answer. He wants to discuss other options for my future, Clara said. Other positions, I think. More permanent ones. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the late March wind moved through the yard. "Are you going to go?" Nora asked. "I don't know," Clara said, because she didn't, and she wasn't going to lie about it. Nora looked at the envelope. Her jaw did the thing it did when she was processing something difficult and refusing to let it show too much. "I was rude to you," she said, "when you first came." "I know," Clara said. "I didn't take it personally." "You should have," Nora said. I was horrible. And then I was unfair. I kept waiting for you to leave or to start making everything about yourself because everyone who'd come before—" She stopped. "There were 2 women who tried to help after Mama died, before Papa found you through Hale. They were both perfectly decent, but they left, one after 2 weeks, one after 6, and I decided not to—" She pressed her lips together. "You decided not to let yourself depend on anyone who was going to leave," Clara said. Nora looked at her. "Yes." Clara looked back at her. The 17-year-old girl who had been performing adulthood for longer than anyone should have to, who sang quietly in the kitchen when she thought no one could hear, who had written a letter to a friend because Clara had said, "At least you'll know." "Tell me something honestly," Nora said. "Not to make me feel better. Just honestly." "All right. Do you want to stay?" Clara looked at the kitchen around her. The stove she'd learned, the window through which she'd watched Montana's seasons shift, the table where Thomas had finished his first full page, and May had eaten her 3rd butter cookie, and Silas had sat across from her in the 4 o'clock dark and fumbled for words that wouldn't come out right, and said them anyway. "Yes," she said. "I want to stay." Nora nodded once. She picked up her cloth and went back to the windowsill. "Then maybe," she said carefully, "you should tell Papa about the letter." Edmund Hale arrived on the 14th of April. Clara had told Silas the previous week. She'd sat down across from him at the kitchen table in the evening, the children in bed, and put the letter in front of him and waited while he read it. His face had gone through several things that she watched and did not comment on. When he finished, he set the letter down on the table between them. "Other options," he said. "That's what he says." "What does that mean?" "I think it means another household, something he considers more stable." She paused. "He's always been practical about me. I don't think he's trying to interfere. He thinks he's looking out for my interests." Silas looked at the letter for a moment. "Is he? Looking out for your interests?" She thought about this honestly. "He's looking out for what he thinks my interests are," she said. Which is not quite the same thing. He was quiet. He had that look he sometimes got over the accounts, working through a problem, finding the shape of it. "What do you want?" he said. It was the same question Nora had asked, and he asked it in the same straight way, with the same expectation of a real answer. She held his gaze. "I know what I want," she said. "I'm less sure about whether it's practical." "Tell me what you want, and I'll tell you if it's practical," he said. "Silas." "Clara." She looked at him across the table in the kitchen that was starting to show signs of spring outside its windows. The first patches of bare ground emerging where the snow had pulled back from the south-facing slopes. She thought about 11 months on a contract that had become, somewhere in the weeks of blizzards and fevers and 4 o'clock conversations, something else entirely, something that didn't have a word she'd been given. "I want to stay," she said. "Not the contract. I want to stay." The words sat between them. He leaned forward, both arms on the table, and looked at her with those pale, careful eyes that she had learned to read over 4 months of proximity. And what was in them now was not the managed blankness of his early weeks, not the grief weight, not the careful distance. It was something more exposed and more difficult than any of those things. "Then we'll talk to Hale when he comes," he said. "Together." Edmund Hale arrived in a hired wagon in the mid-afternoon, dressed for the territory in clothing that was practically appropriate but still somehow wrong, the way city-bought frontier clothes always were. He was the same as she remembered, careful, measured, the kind of man whose primary relationship to the world was managerial. He looked at the ranch with the assessing eye of someone calculating whether it confirmed or contradicted his expectations. Clara met him on the porch. The children were inside. She'd asked them to be, and they had agreed with varying degrees of willingness, though she'd seen Eli's face in the sitting room window as she came down the porch steps, and she expected to see it again. "Clara?" Hale said. He looked her over with the particular assessment she'd always found both attentive and somehow impersonal, the look of a man taking inventory. "You look well." "I am well," she said. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." He came in. Silas was in the kitchen, which was where they'd agreed he would be. Present, not aggressive, simply there. Hale looked at Silas the way men of his type looked at men of Silas's type, and Silas looked back at him the way Silas looked at most things, which was to say steadily and without particular accommodation. They shook hands. "Mr. Mercer," Hale said, "I appreciate you allowing me to visit." "It's Claire's decision who visits," Silas said. "I didn't allow it. She did." Hale looked at Clara. Something recalibrated slightly in his expression. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Hale talked about the journey and the territory and the weather and the condition of the roads, and then, in his careful, managed way, he moved toward his point. "I've been in correspondence with a family in Helena," he said, addressing Clara directly, in the way he always had. He had always spoken to her as if she were a competent adult. She'd give him that. "The Whitfield family. They have a large household, 4 children, and they're looking for someone with exactly your experience and capabilities. The position would be, significantly more comfortable. Better pay, better facilities, a more established family situation." He paused. "I thought you should know the option exists." Clara held her coffee cup. "And in exchange?" she said. He looked mildly surprised. "There's no exchange. It's simply an option." "You drove 3 hours out of your way to offer me an option," she said. "What is it you're actually asking?" Hale set his cup down. The measured calm held, but there was something under it. She'd lived in his house long enough to read the subtext he ran everything through. "I'm asking you to consider whether this situation, a small gesture encompassing the kitchen, the ranch, the implicit rest of it, is truly the best place for your future. You're 19 years old, Clara. You've been in difficult households for 7 years. You deserve—" "What?" she said. "What do I deserve?" "Stability," he said. "A clear trajectory." "I have stability," she said. "I have work that matters, and people who need what I can give, and—" She stopped. She was aware of Silas at the table beside her, not looking at her, looking at his cup, but present. "I have a place," she said. "I know that's not what you arranged for me to find here, but I found it anyway." Hale looked at her for a moment, then at Silas, then back. "I see," he said. "The contract has 7 months remaining," Clara said. "I know that. I'm not asking you to forgive it or renegotiate it. I'll honor what was agreed." "The contract," Hale said carefully, "is between you and Mr. Mercer. I can't compel you to go anywhere. I'm simply—" He paused. "I'm your guardian, Clara, and that means something to me, even if the formal arrangement is nearly done. I want to know you're making this decision with a clear head." "I am," she said. He looked at her with a scrutiny that was not unkind, and whatever he found in her face apparently satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "You've changed," he said. "Since you left, you stand differently." He said it like a fact, not a compliment. "I know," she said. Hale looked at Silas. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I'll say plainly what I'm thinking, since the 3 of us seem to be operating on plain speech." "Appreciated," Silas said. "Clara has had no one in 7 years who treated her as anything other than useful," Hale said. There was something in his voice that was the closest he ever came to guilt, she thought. A flatness that meant he was saying something he'd been carrying. "I am aware that I contributed to that. I want to know that's changed." Silas looked at him. "She's not useful to this family," he said. "She's necessary to it. There's a difference." The kitchen was quiet. Hale looked at the table. He picked up his coffee cup and finished what was in it, and then he set it down and straightened the handle so it was parallel to the table edge. The small, precise gesture of a man who organized the world in front of him when he was feeling something he didn't have language for. "All right," he said. "Then I'll say only this." He looked at Clara. "If this is where you want to be, and I believe you when you say it is, then be here. Don't spend the next 7 months with 1 foot out the door because you're waiting for the contract to end before you let yourself commit to it." He paused. "You've always done that. In every household. Kept something back, stayed a little portable. It's a sensible thing to do when you have no security. But it's not a life. She stared at him. She had not expected that from Edmund Hale. He stood from the table, the meeting apparently concluded by his own internal schedule. I'll be on my way. I have another 3 hours of road before dark. He looked at her once more. Write to Patricia, he said. She asks about you. She nearly said something ungracious about Patricia, but she caught it and held it. All right, she said. Hale nodded to Silas, shook his hand again, and Clara walked him to the porch. He climbed up into the hired wagon with the effortful dignity of a man who was not built for wagon climbing, and he looked down at her. He's a good man, he said. He's a difficult man, she said. He's trying. Well, Hale said, that's more than most. He picked up the reins. Take care of yourself, Clara. I always have, she said. He drove out of the yard. She stood on the porch and watched the wagon go, and the wind came off the hills, and the sky was the particular pale blue of a Montana April that has not quite finished the argument with winter. And she breathed. She was still standing there when the front door opened behind her. She expected Silas. It was Sam. He came and stood beside her on the porch, in his coat and his boots, and he slipped his hand into hers with the quiet completeness of a person who has decided. He looked out at the yard where the wagon had been, and then he looked up at her. He didn't say anything. He hadn't said anything to anyone in 7 months. But he held her hand, and he stayed. She looked down at him. The dark Mercer hair, the serious eyes, the small composed face that had watched her and assessed her and decided, somewhere in the weeks of darning and barn visits and foot pressed against hers under the table, that she was safe. Okay, she said softly, not to him particularly, just to the air, to the yard and the hills and the unreasonable, terrifying, and completely unarguable fact of where she was standing. When Silas came out a few minutes later, she was still there, Sam's hand in hers. He stood beside her on the other side. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, the way he stood in the cold every morning, present, deliberate, making a decision by the simple act of not leaving. He's not wrong, she said, meaning Hale. About keeping something back. No, Silas said. He's not. She looked out at the hills. I don't know how to stop doing it. I know, he said. Neither do I. A pause. Maybe that's something we figure out. She looked at him. His face was not performing anything. It was just his face, tired and weathered and uncertain and right there in front of her, not managed, not at a careful distance. We, she said. If that's a word you want to use, he said, and his voice had something rough in it that was not quite steadiness but was aiming for it. She looked back at the hills. Sam's hand was warm in hers. The barn was 60 yards out across the yard, solid and familiar. The porch railing that had been loose in February was fixed. The kitchen behind her smelled of the coffee they'd made for Hale and the bread she'd started that morning. She thought about the planting journal with both sets of handwriting in the margins. She thought about the 4 o'clock dark and the almost laugh, and a man who communicated in subtext and expected to be understood. She thought, 1 foot out the door. She thought, not anymore. We, she said, and this time it wasn't a question. Sam tightened his hand around hers very slightly, and the hills held on to the last of the afternoon light. And on the porch of the Mercer Ranch, 3 people stood in the cold, and none of them moved toward the door. The word we turned out to be harder to live inside than it was to say. Not because either of them withdrew it, neither did, but because knowing what you want and knowing how to have it are 2 entirely different kinds of knowledge, and Clara and Silas Mercer were both, in their different ways, people who had spent a long time learning how to manage without the second kind. He had built his self-sufficiency out of necessity and geography, and the specific loneliness of a man who had loved one woman completely and watched that completeness taken away. She had built hers out of 7 years of households that taught her, with varying degrees of gentleness, that depending on any situation continuing was a form of stupidity she couldn't afford. You don't unlearn those things because you've named them. You just start to see them when they're happening. April moved into May. The land changed character around them. The definitive change. The one that felt like a door finally swinging open after months of promising to. The snow pulled back from the hills, revealing the brown-gray ground underneath, and then the green came up through it. Tentative at first, and then with conviction. The way green always came back here. Not gradually, but in a rush, as if the land had been planning it the whole time it was frozen. Clara started the kitchen garden in the first week of May. She turned the beds herself, early mornings before the rest of the household was up, the ground still cold enough to make the work effortful. She used Ruth's planting journal and her own notes together, cross-referencing what had worked where, planning the layout the way Ruth had described it. Tomatoes along the south fence, mint contained in its own separate corner so it wouldn't take over the world. She was on her knees working the east bed one morning, the sun barely up, when Sam appeared beside her with a small trowel. She hadn't heard him come out. He crouched down next to her and without any discussion began working the earth beside her with focused seriousness. She didn't remark on it. She just made room. They worked like that for an hour, the boy and the woman, in the early morning quiet, while the house slowly woke up around them. When Nora came to the back door and called breakfast, Sam stood, brushed his hands on his pants, and went inside without looking back. Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the turned bed and felt something so simple it almost didn't have a name, just the plain fact of having been chosen, without condition, by someone who didn't give that away lightly. She was learning, slowly, that belonging didn't announce itself with ceremony. It accumulated in small, undramatic moments. A child's trowel working beside hers. A letter from Jessie Parrish that Nora read aloud at the supper table, laughing at a part of it. Thomas looking up from a book to say, without prompting, that he thought he wanted to read law someday, and the way the sentence landed, not tentative, not braced for skepticism, just said, because he'd been somewhere long enough to feel safe saying it. And Silas. Silas was not an easy man to love. She was honest with herself about that, in the way she was honest about most things. He went silent when he should speak and spoke when silence would have served better. He was stubborn in the specific structural way of a man who had made a decision about how things worked and required significant evidence to revisit it. He still walked out into the cold every morning as a transitional ritual, still held everything at one remove until he decided it was safe, still sometimes sat across from her at the kitchen table and communicated something full and complicated entirely, through the angle of his shoulders and the set of his jaw, and not a single word. But he was trying. She could see it. The daily, effortful, imperfect trying. The way he'd stopped letting whole days pass without saying something real to his children. The way he'd catch himself starting to retreat, and then, visibly, choose not to. It was not transformation. It was more like renovation. The slow, unglamorous work of changing the interior of something while the structure held. She loved him for the trying more than she would have loved him for being finished. One evening in mid-May, he came in from the evening chores to find her at the kitchen table with the household accounts. She'd taken them over formally in March with his agreement. He was better with the landside numbers, and she was better with the domestic ones. And between them, they developed a working system that reduced the duplication and caught the gaps that had been slipping through when it was all on him. She'd found 2 billionaires from the previous autumn that had been quietly draining the accounts, and recovering that money had made a meaningful difference to the spring budget. He stood in the doorway, looking at her with the particular expression she'd come to know as his version of something he found difficult to say. "What?" she said, without looking up. "The Henderson boy came by today," he said, "about the north fence line." "And?" "And nothing. Fence is fine. He was being neighborly." A pause. "He asked if I was planning to expand the operation this summer. Said his father might be willing to partner on a small cattle expansion if I was interested." She looked up. "Are you interested?" she asked. "I might be." He came in properly and sat down. "It would mean more hands, more costs up front. But the calving went better this spring than the last 2 years, and if the garden does what you're projecting—" He shook his head slightly. "It changes the numbers." She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to the column she'd been working on. "I ran a version with a modest expansion already," she said. "3 weeks ago. I was going to wait until the garden was in before I mentioned it." He looked at the numbers, then at her. "You ran the numbers 3 weeks ago," he said. "Someone had to." "Without telling me." "I was going to tell you." She pulled the ledger back. "I just told you." He sat back in his chair. He had the expression that meant he was fighting with whether to be annoyed or not, and the not was winning. "You could just tell me when you're thinking about things," he said. "You don't have to have the full answer before you bring me the question." She looked at him. He looked back. "Hale wasn't wrong," she said, "about keeping things back. No, he said. He wasn't. I'm working on it. I know, he said. So am I. He pulled the ledger back toward him and looked at her numbers properly. After a moment, he said, "The projection on the tomatoes is optimistic." "Ruth grew them here for 6 years," Clara said. "I know what the yield should be. She had a particularly good south fence year in, I think it was 79, inflated the whole baseline. It's in the journal. I adjusted for it." He looked at her. "Page 42, she said. Margin note in my handwriting, bottom right." He turned to page 42 of the planting journal, which he had apparently been carrying in his head as the household accounts document, and found her note in the bottom right margin. Something happened in his face that was not quite a smile and was better than one. "You're very annoying," he said. "I know," she said. He turned the page back to the accounts, and they worked through the numbers together. And outside, the Montana Spring made its full-throated argument for itself against the kitchen windows, and the house around them was full of the sounds of children in their various evening occupations, and neither of them said anything about what was still unsaid between them, because there are times when what's unsaid fills a room more completely than words would. The thing that had been building since April came to its reckoning on a Saturday evening in late May, 6 days before the first anniversary of Clara's arrival at the ranch. It came because of Sam. Sam had been, in the week since Hale's visit, in a period of change that Clara had been watching carefully and not naming aloud, because she was afraid that naming it would somehow destabilize it. He had continued to not speak in words. That hadn't changed, but he had begun, incrementally, to initiate, to bring things to people, to place a carved animal on Clara's work surface and leave it there, a gift or a message or simply a fact, to stand in the doorway of the barn when Silas was working and wait, and to stay when Silas noticed him and said, without pressure, "Come in if you want." On the Saturday evening, they were all in the sitting room after supper, all of them, which itself was something that had become normal over the preceding weeks. The whole family in the same room without anyone manufacturing an excuse to be elsewhere. Nora was writing. Thomas was reading, sprawled on the floor with his cheek on his fist. May and Eli were engaged in a game that involved small stones and a set of rules that appeared to evolve continuously and that only they understood. Silas was in the armchair with the accounts. Clara was at the end of the sofa with mending. Sam was in his usual corner with his animals. And then he stood up. He walked across the room, which was not remarkable. He walked to Clara, which was also not remarkable. He stood in front of her and she looked up from the mending. He held out his hand. In it was the carved wooden horse, the one she recognized, a small careful carving that was clearly meant to be Juniper. He'd had it since she'd first seen his collection, one of the older pieces, worn smooth in the places his hands always went. He was holding it out to her, not showing it, giving it. She looked at it, and then at him. "Sam," she said, "that's yours." He kept his hand out. His expression was the composed, deliberate expression of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it. She took the horse. He closed her fingers around it with both his small hands, carefully, and then he went back to his corner and resumed his arrangement. The room had gone still around them. Even the stone game had paused. Nora from the table made a small, tight sound that was not quite a word and turned back to her letter. Thomas had lifted his head from his hand. He looked at Clara and then at his book and said, with the studied neutrality of a 10-year-old who has been ambushed by his own feelings, "It's the Juniper carving. He never gives that one to anyone." "I know," Clara said. She looked at the carved horse in her hand. The wood was warm from Sam's carrying it. She closed her fingers around it. When she looked up, Silas was watching her from the armchair. He'd put the accounts down at some point. She hadn't seen him do it. His face was doing the fully unmanaged thing, no distance, no calibration, just him looking at her over the heads of his children with everything visible that he'd been keeping under for months. He stood up. "Children," he said, "go up." A collective sound arose that was not quite protest. 15 minutes early, he said. "I'll come up later." The negotiation lasted another 30 seconds, and then the room emptied with the organized chaos of 5 children in various states of reluctance. May demanding to finish the stone game, and Eli saying it was already done, and Thomas walking past with his book open and already reading the next page. Sam going last, pausing at the doorway to look at Clara once with his dark, serious eyes before going up. The sitting room was quiet. Clara was still on the sofa. The carved horse was in her hand. Silas was standing in the middle of the room, and for a moment he looked exactly like a man who has made a decision to speak and has arrived at the moment of speaking and found it considerably harder than the deciding. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I've been thinking about it for a while, about the right way to say it." He exhaled. "I haven't found a right way. So I'm going to say it wrongly and ask you to take the meaning rather than the execution." "That's how you communicate most things," she said. "I know," he said. "Ruth used to say the same." He moved and sat at the other end of the sofa, not beside her but facing her, turned slightly. His elbows were on his knees and he was looking at his hands. "When Ruth died, I made a decision, I think, without knowing I was making it, that the life we'd built was done. That I would keep the ranch going for the children because that's what she'd have wanted, and I'd raise them as best I could, and that would be the shape of it." He paused. "And then you came." She waited. "You didn't come to save anyone," he said. "You came because Hale needed you gone and I needed someone competent, and you had no better option. I know that. You know I know that." He looked up. "But you stayed past the need, past the contract. In every way that matters, you stayed past it." "Silas, let me finish," he said. "I've been building up to this for about 3 months, and if I stop, I may not get back to it." She closed her mouth. "I have thought for a long time that moving forward meant leaving Ruth behind," he said. "That if I let myself—" He stopped, found the word. "If I let myself want something again, it was a kind of disloyalty. To her, to what we had." He shook his head. "And I figured out that's wrong. Not because the feeling isn't real. It is real. I think it'll probably always be a part of how I'm put together. But because Ruth Mercer was not a woman who would have wanted her family to stop living to honor her memory." He looked at Clara steadily. "She wrote notes for whoever came after. She put them through the house like lights left on. She wanted someone to find them and know what to do. She didn't do that because she expected us to stay frozen." Clara thought about the notes. "When I'm gone," the planting journal, the blue hem towels on the third shelf. The woman she'd never met who had prepared the way for her. "She would have argued with you," Clara said. "I can tell." He almost smiled. "Constantly, huh?" He said, "She never let me get away with anything." He looked at his hands again. "I'm not good at this. I'm not going to suddenly become good at it. I'll still say the wrong thing and go quiet when I should talk, and work too long and expect people to read what I mean." He looked up. "But I'm asking you to stay, not the contract. You. Clara Bellamy, who rides 14 miles in a blizzard's aftermath for a child that isn't even legally hers, who writes in the margins of dead women's journals and means it as a compliment, who talked my son through his reading and sat with my daughter through her fear and made my 15-year-old write a letter to her friend because she understood that Nora needed to be 15 years old again." He stopped. "I'm asking you to stay as my partner, as the person I want next to me when I'm trying to figure out how to be better at this." The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, the May evening was going down in slow, rose-colored stages over the Montana hills. The house breathed around them. Clara looked at the carved horse in her hand. She thought about the very first night she'd spent in this house. The narrow bed, the sticking latch, the cold glass of the north-facing window. She thought about the woman who had mapped the emotional geography of this family in the margins of recipe books and ledgers and the back of flour sacks. She thought about 19 years of being useful until she wasn't needed, portable until someone moved her, present until someone arranged for her to be elsewhere. She thought about Sam handing her the horse. She thought about what it meant to choose rather than to accept. "I'm not easy either," she said. "I keep things back. I work problems before I bring them to anyone. I'll have opinions about how things should be done, and I won't always be right, but I won't always be wrong either, and I'll argue both cases equally hard." She paused. "I don't know how to be someone who assumes they're going to stay. I've been learning it here, but I'm not finished learning it." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for finished." She looked at him. The pale, careful eyes that she had spent months learning to read, that were not being careful at all right now. Just open, just him. The difficult and trying and genuinely good man who communicated in subtext and had told her so himself, who had walked up a frozen ridge on his wedding anniversary because she'd said the children might like it, and he'd needed someone to give him permission to try. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "That's my answer." He reached across the space between them on the sofa, and his hand closed over hers. Both of them, the one that held the carved horse and the one alongside it. And he held on. Not dramatically, not with anything flourishing about it, just held on, the way you hold something you were afraid you'd lost the chance at. "Okay," he said. His voice was rough. "Okay," she said. They stayed like that for a while in the sitting room with the evening coming through the windows. And from upstairs came the sounds of 5 children being various versions of not asleep. And after a while, Silas called up that he was coming, which produced a sudden and unconvincing silence. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. "You should go up," she said. "I should," he said. He stood, and then he stopped. He looked down at her with an expression that was at peace in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Not resolved, because there was still everything that would need to be built and navigated and worked through, but something underneath the unresolved that had settled. The fundamental thing that had been fighting itself had stopped fighting. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He went upstairs. She heard his boots on each step, heard the murmur of his voice, and then Eli's, then May's, then the quiet. She sat in the sitting room for a long time after that, the carved horse warm in her hand, the house quiet around her. She thought about the girl who had arrived in the mud outside this house 14 months ago with one battered bag and not a single person in the world who would miss her if she disappeared. She thought about how that girl had not known, could not have known, that the place she was being sent away from was not the place she needed, and that this cold, struggling, broken open house in the middle of enormous country was going to ask more of her than any place she'd been and give back more than she'd known how to want. She didn't think it was simple. She didn't think the hard parts were behind them. There would be seasons on this ranch that tested all of it, drought years and loss years, and the ordinary grinding difficulty of building something durable in a place that didn't make anything easy. There would be days when Silas went silent and she kept too much back, and they'd have to find their way back to each other through the familiar, effortful route of two people who don't come naturally to openness, but have decided to try anyway. The children would grow and become themselves in ways that were not always predictable or comfortable. Nora would leave eventually, for school, for her own life, with the competence she'd built through necessity redirected into choice. Thomas would find out whether he meant it about the law. The twins would grow into whatever Eli and May turned out to actually be, which was already more interesting and more complicated than childhood suggested. And Sam. Sam would find his way to words eventually, or he wouldn't. Either way, Clara had come to understand that his silence was not absence. It was a language with its own grammar, and she'd been learning it for over a year. Whatever words he found or didn't find, she would be there to meet them. She set the carved horse on the windowsill, where the last of the evening light caught the wood and made it glow. She thought about Ruth Mercer's handwriting and her own in the margins of the same journal. She thought about what it meant that she'd kept writing in it, not over Ruth's words, not replacing them, but alongside them. That was the right image, she thought, for all of it. Not replacement, not erasure, not pretending the grief hadn't happened or the loss wasn't real, just alongside. The way two people can walk the same ground and both leave marks on it, and the ground holds both. She turned off the lamp and went upstairs. The latch on her door didn't stick anymore. Silas had fixed it in February, quietly, while she was occupied elsewhere, and had not mentioned it. She'd noticed and hadn't mentioned it either. They'd had a whole conversation about it in the subtext, the way they had most of their important conversations. She went to the window and looked out at the ranch in the late evening. The barn solid at 60 yards, the corral fence, the south garden beds she'd turned that week, the hills beyond with the last light draining off them into a deep, clear dark. The stars up here were not like stars anywhere she'd lived before. They were too many and too close, and they made you feel simultaneously very small and very specifically located, as if the scale of the dark only emphasized where, precisely, you were standing. She was standing in the right place. That was not a small thing. Most people spent their whole lives trying to find it, that particular convergence of here and now, and this is mine. And many of them never did. She had found it at 19 years old in the last place anyone would have sent her on purpose, through a combination of luck and stubbornness and the accumulated force of a dead woman's practical wisdom and a living man's effortful trying and 5 children who had let her in by degrees, each in their own way, each on their own schedule. She had not saved the Mercer family. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own mind. They had been saving themselves. Nora with her fierce, exhausted competence, Thomas with his stubborn working through, Silas with his slow and painful turning back toward presence, and Sam, who had simply waited in his corner until the world felt safe enough to give someone the one thing he valued most. What she had done was stay. She had shown up and done the work, and stayed when it was hard, and stayed when she was afraid, and stayed when leaving would have been safer, and in staying she had become part of the fabric of something. That, she thought, was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Below her, the ranch was quiet. The garden beds waited for the tomatoes she'd start this week, the mint already going in its contained corner, the south fence already showing what it could do in the early warmth. By fall, there would be more than enough, and they would put by what they needed, and the winter would come as it always did, and they would meet it as they now knew how to do. Together, imperfectly, with enough wood in the box and enough honesty between them to make the dark navigable. Clara Bellamy stood at the window of the room that was hers, not by contract, not by utility, but by the slow and irreversible accumulation of everything that had happened in the past year, and she looked out at the enormous Montana dark, and she felt, for the first time in 19 years, no particular desire to be anywhere else. The latch on the door didn't stick. The carved horse sat on the windowsill. The house breathed around her, full of people who would still be there in the morning. She had been 19 years old and treated like something portable, like a problem to be relocated. She was still 19 years old, but she was also, now and from here forward, the woman who had looked at a broken household in the hardest winter the territory had seen in years, and had chosen it, had chosen all of them, had let herself be chosen back. That was not the ending she'd been given. It was the one she'd made. And outside, the Montana dark held the ranch and the hills and the river far below, and the stars were too many to count. And somewhere in the hayloft, a barn cat was conducting its private business, and tomorrow the work would begin again, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was real, and that was exactly enough.